Welcome back to Hot Flashes and Cold Topics, everybody. We are so excited today to have Christy Bowe on. And Christy Bowe is a photojournalist for the White House since the Clinton years. It's really exciting. She has a book out titled Eyes That Speak, One Woman News Photographer's Journey with History Makers. And I am like a big presidential historic buff. So I am super excited to talk to you today. Welcome to the show, Christy.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I've read your book and I would love for you to share with our readers how this came about, how this job as a photographer, and if you could share a little bit about how you got into this position in the White House.
Sure. Well, first off, I'm a member of the White House Press Corps.
Oh,
So I'm not hired by the White House. I'm not a White House staff photographer. We members of the press corps, the advantage that we have is that we stay through different administrations. The staff photographers for each president leave upon their leaving. So I've been fortunate enough to have been able to photograph the last 5 presidents, and I'm currently photographing Biden, covering him. But the downside of that is the staff photographers, of course, get better access than we do. But the good news is we get the longevity. So I am one of just a couple of women still photographers who have covered 5 administrations. And as far as how I got into this, I was traveling with some friends cross country when and took, I don't know if you guys are old enough to remember the old 110 cameras with the little teeny negatives, the little flat cameras with the square
yes.
flash
Yes.
bulbs on.
Yes.
So I was using those, came back, took a ton of pictures, and those little square pictures came back. And I was like, that's not what I saw. That's, of course, going to Texas, there's a lot of flat land down there. So it was not what I had seen. So that kind of began my fascination with wanting people to be able to see through my point of view. And then I came back and got a 35 millimeter camera and went to school and took some classes, and then started hanging out with other people who were photographers, and started working for a little newspaper, taking pictures of their real estate and getting into the real estate section of the houses. And then I started doing things for the local government and more of in the public information office. So it was more people oriented and people doing things. And to me, that was of much better interest to me and a little more challenging. So then one day I went down because I wanted to get, some more people experience. And I went down to a pro-choice rally in Washington where there was tens of thousands of people, and thinking, well, this is great. I got plenty of subjects. It's all good. And I may or may not have had a legitimate press pass and ran into somebody there who kind of called me on that and said, well, that was a nice job, but that's really, that's not the real thing. Here's the real thing, which he had. And then he said, but he appreciated my workmanship. And he goes, how'd you like to come up on the press truck with us? And which he had no authority to do. and I said, sure. And I jumped on and never looked back. Since that, I became really hooked on covering the news. And that photographer, Mark Reinstein, he worked for UPI and ended up, we're still friends to this day. He ended up introducing me to the photo editor there, and I worked for a while at UPI, United Press International. And then from there, met Sarah McClendon, who I talk about in my first chapter. And for any of your listeners who are of age here
most are well
Most
over
of us
40.
are. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
Most over
okay.
40.
Yeah.
Okay, well, those of you who remember Helen Thomas, who I was so proud to have her do the foreword for my book. And she always sat in the front row of the White House, and she's since passed away. Well, one of her buddies was Sarah McClendon, who I ended up being her photographer, and she covered the White House, and uh, she scared all the presidents. They were so worried about what would come out of her mouth. Bill Clinton said that in an interview. He said, I was always terrified to call on her because she would just get right to the heart of the matter and with no holes barred. And she really was quite good at having the president recognize her. She just could not, she would not be ignored. That's
Yeah.
that's why I named that chapter, because she would go, Mr. President, and then it would get louder and louder, and finally, Mr. President, and then everybody's like, make it stop. So they'd have to call on her. So that was kind of cool. And she showed me the ropes there, and she was the voice of the little people. So like often when we would go to an event of some kind, and she had access to all kinds of things, and me being her photographer, so did I. And we would often travel by cab. And as I say in my book, Eyes That Speak, that we were one day going to the White House for a press conference for President Clinton. And the cab driver, she always insisted on sitting in the front seat with the cab driver. And she would always talk with them about their life and, everything. It was just kind of cool. And so this one particular day stuck out of my mind, where she asked this cab driver if he could ask the president of the United States anything, what would that be? And he had a question about immigration of some kind. I can't remember the exact question. And 45 minutes later, she was asking the president of the United States that cab driver's question. And that to me was just so cool, that she would, be such a voice for people. And so, I learned some really valuable experience from working with her. And then later on, I don't know, maybe 5 years later or so, I said, Sarah, I would kind of like to start my own little photography news service, image catcher news service. And then you kind of have to have somebody sponsor you for credentials and things like that for the White House and Capitol Hill, and show that you are, affiliated with legitimate news services in order to get a pass. And she said, absolutely. And really was all about giving people a hand up. And that's what, I think is just so important all the way around, because now in news, being a 24-hour news cycle, things are so competitive that because there's so many news outlets and people, reporting stories, and everybody's pretty much a reporter now. Anybody that's got a cell phone can be a reporter. And there's good and bad with that, obviously. And so that's how that happened. And then I switched over, like I say, to Image Catcher News, and I've been with, with my little news organization. And, I am represented by Zuma Press and Getty Images.
You have been through 5 presidential administrations. And number one, I want to know what you've seen kind of change with each administration, but also you have been through some of the most incredible events that we have lived through, like 9/11 and like January 6th. And have you noticed that it's getting more difficult to be in the press now than it was in the beginning?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Not only that, I mean, I learned that firsthand at the insurrection on January 6th, that the media was the enemy of the people, for sure. People were smashing TV cameras. CNN had their cameras smashed and lit on fire. Another woman news photographer got punched in the face and her camera smashed, stomped on. It was, I ended up after having a face-to-face encounter with a bunch of the Proud Boys, and they were yelling derogatory things. about the media. I ended up stashing my credentials in my jacket for the rest of the time I was there so that I could just be one of the crowd and not targeted. So yeah, that has come a long way. Then several years ago, the media was so demonized that a lot of the reporters had to have bodyguards, armed bodyguards, accompany them to like rallies and things like that. That's just unbelievable to me for how things started out, years ago when I was first starting out in Clinton's first administration. He had he and Hillary had a fair for us, where a carnival on the south lawn of the White House, and it was all hush hush. And then one day it said, the president's having something for us, come on out. And we came out and there was like Ferris wheels and merry-go-rounds and cookouts and beer. And it was like, wow, that was just unbelievable. I mean, there was at one time a really good relationship with the press. Now, true, the Monica Lewinsky thing put a little bit of a damper on that, because then, it was everybody for themselves. They're trying to cover that story. And then things kind of, they were still pretty good compared to, access was much better. I mean, that's, I think, is one of the things I have seen change, sadly, through each administration. It gets less and less. I was just at the Biden bill signing a few weeks ago, where he was signing for the bill chips and the economy and everything in the state dining room. And normally there would have been a ton of people there. There would have been a lot of media coverage, and you have to RSVP now to get into events. And a lot of times they'll say, no, we can't accommodate you. And then you get into the room, and one of the big rooms like the East Room or the state dining room, which is a large area, and you see they're only utilizing like half the space. Now, not in the case of what I'm just talking about that I was at a couple of weeks ago. They utilize the space pretty well there, but there was just much less of us. There was maybe, I don't know, 12 photographers, maybe 15, where there used to be like 75.
Do you think that's a pandemic thing? Or?
I think it is. I think it is, but it's kind of like, and it also at the Capitol, there's that too. I've been trying to cover the January 6th hearings, and that's difficult because they only are giving out, when they used to give out something like 50 or 75 passes, because you have to have an individual pass for every single event that happens. So the passes, they only gave out like 25. And
Are there any secrets to getting the first to be chosen to be on the passes?
Well, it helps if you're like with the AP or something, or one of the
Mm-hmm.
larger news organizations, then yeah, that's great. And if you're there every single day, that helps too. But basically, it's just much more limited for everything in Washington than what it was. And it's going to be interesting to see if this is the new normal. That's what concerns me. And then even looking out, and obviously, the whole country has been through terrible times, especially with COVID and everything else. Just, it seemed like there was just back to back problems and crises, which, for people in my line of work, it's keeping us real busy, but it's also exhausting. And looking out, because I had a terrible time trying to figure, when should I say the end to this book? Because it's very difficult when you're writing about news that's continuously happening. So I was thinking the beginning of President Obama's first inauguration. There you go. That's it. And no. And I was like, well, maybe I'll just do this and that. And then next thing I knew, it was 8 years later. I was like, well, I may as well do President Trump's inauguration. And then, as we know, that was a very wild ride there for 4 years. So there was a lot to cover. And, President Trump really changed the way things were done down there, much more so than what any of us were used to. Like there used to be regular presidential press conferences all the time, and they were at least minimum of a half a dozen times a year, sometimes more. Clinton used to have them all the time. Bush had them all the time, much more than that. And then Obama also had them, not as much, but a lot, enough to be decent. And then Trump had like two. And one of them was the famous one with Jim Acosta, where the two of them got into it. I was there for that one. But other than that, he kind of redefined, if you think about it, instead of like most presidents, you're holding the feet to their fire for an hour, right? The reporters are, and asking questions, and everybody's getting we're getting nice expressions from all the different topics that are brought up, and it usually makes for nice pictures. And that just was not happening. So I think President Trump, on the other press conference that he had, people were sitting around, and you were afraid to even go into the bathroom without your camera, because it could come on the speakers that, okay, gather, we're doing something now, and then you'd have to be ready to run, which is how he did that first press conference. But how he kind of changed things around was that he, and in fairness to him, people were kind of not saying what he was saying. A lot of times they'd report something different than what he said. So he wanted to be the one to say what he meant and what he had to say. But of course that worked two ways too, because I would hear him say things sometimes and get home and hear something else. And I was like, well, how'd that happen? I was right there. That's not what, but anyway, so there was a lot of mix up there, but he started this tradition of stopping to talk to the media on his way from the Oval Office or the private residence to his helicopter Marine One on the South Lawn. And then that became a tremendous event for people, where normally there'd be, a dozen or two people to watch the president arrive or depart, because usually he just waves and maybe we'll take one question. This became a big thing where there'd be like 100 people every time he came or went. And that was often. He traveled constantly. So, but he would also take questions from anybody. It didn't matter if you were a little news organization or a big one, he would take questions. However, we had to breathe in all the fumes from the helicopter because the engine was running. And as you may recall, having seen many clips to this, if it's something that he didn't want to talk about or didn't want to hear, he'd go, "What? Can't hear it because of the helicopter." And then, when he got tired of taking questions, he'd say, "Gotta go." And so that it could be a 10-minute thing or it could be 20 minutes, but he controlled the whole thing. And so that was kind of smart if you think about it. And then since then, of course, there's been no presidential press conferences at the White House. President Biden does things off camera, and COVID is still a real issue. So I hope that passes, but it bothers me personally to see the press secretary speaking and people calling that a press conference, because that's not how I know a press conference to be from being old school. So that's a long answer to your short question.
Oh, no,
That's okay.
it's interesting. It's so interesting. And I thought also in the book, it was interesting between the presidents, some preferred video or camera, that kind of camera, some preferred still photography. And could you talk about the pools, who was in this pool, the first pool, second pool? Can you explain that?
Yes. So the pool, the White House has what's called a pool, which is the people that have been assigned to the president, and that usually is for the week, from the major news organizations and agencies. And those people get special access and priority to different events. for whatever the president's doing. If he's doing like the bill signing I was at a couple of weeks ago, the travel pool, or the in-town travel pool, which is what you call if he's staying right there at the White House, versus the travel pool if he's traveling like he is today. So the in-town travel pool will get special priority, so they get to go in ahead of everybody else and pick their position, and we all have little ladders that we have that are quite handy for, I'll sit on it if I need a break once in a while, now that I'm older and have 2 fake knees and a what you call a broken spine.
Ooh.
I tend to want to sit down from time to time. So I have one of those little folding ladders, and that's great because if you need height and somebody big is in front of you for some reason, you can stand on that and then sit on it when you want to, and you can fold it up, and it's nice and easy. And I put my dog leash on it, slap it on my shoulder, and I'm ready to go.
And
You-
yeah, that oh, go
I would
ahead,
just
Colleen.
wanted, I just wanted to ask you, I know one of the things that you talk about is the fact that having watched and photographed 5 different administrations, that people tend to forget they're human beings that actually
Yes.
are living there and experiencing that. Can you talk about the differences maybe from a human level for each of those presidents, maybe something in their personality that was different?
Well, I think that all of them, I'd say that the commonality from your question, that looking back on this, is all of them have been very family oriented. So the Clintons, for sure, and the Bushes and the Obamas and Trump was extremely family oriented because half his family worked there. So and so they did have that in common. Different presidents would engage with the press more than others. And like I think you guys referred to earlier, there was certain presidents had preferences over TV versus still photographers. And Clinton kind of liked both. And I'm trying to think for Bush. Bush was pretty good also with both, but I would say between the two, he preferred still photographers. And he was my favorite, was George W. Covering him. He was the most real and genuine, and kidded around with us and kidded around with me, because sometimes I would be the only woman still photographer, very rarely, but on a couple of occasions, I was the only woman still photographer in the Oval Office when he was had like another world leader in there with him, and we were in there photographing him, and we're there for a very brief period, like seconds, like 30 seconds, could be less, could be 15. So during that time, it's it's important to make the most of things, but he would kid around, and you're not allowed to speak to the president in the Oval Office unless you're spoken to first, especially if you're not if you are a photographer and not a reporter, because we have an unspoken rule that photographers take pictures and reporters ask questions, so that there's not too much chaos. But the president used to speak to me all the time. Once in a while he would. And one of the times when I was the only woman photographer in there, the handlers at the White House, when they want you to get out of the Oval Office and leave, they'll say, "Thank you very much." And so in this particular time, they said, "Gentlemen, thank you very much." And then President Bush said, "Hey, wait a minute." And then he pointed to me and he goes, "There's a lady here." And so I said, "Thank you for noticing, Mr. President." And then he winked and he goes, "I always notice." And it was in a joking, fun
Right.
kind of way, not a perv way. It was a really nice thing. So, and once in a while he'd say, "How the guys treating you today?" and things like that. So he liked still photographers, I found. Obama, pretty much Well, he didn't mind either. I would say he would probably, well, he had Pete Souza, his personal photographer, that covered a lot of things. So from that standpoint, I think we did not have as good access as we could have because he had Pete Souza doing everything. And we still came in and did things, but a lot of things shrunk down. The whole RSVP thing started in the Obama administration. And then there used to be two waves that we called it, but it's really groups of photographers, like 15 at a time, would go in to give everybody a chance for that 10-15 seconds. And I mean, and how much is that out of an event, right? It's like 1 minute. That's all. 1 minute for two different waves of people, where you could get other points of view from other members of the media. And that was a very valuable thing. And sadly, President Obama decided he didn't want that anymore. Just one wave. So it's never changed back. Now it's one wave. So now half the amount of people get to go, and even less now because of COVID. So so there was that, and I'm trying to address your question about how they're different, and also how things have changed over the 5 in one concise, hopefully it's
That's
concise.
great. You're doing great.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we talked about the Trump situation and the press conferences and all that, and with President Biden, it's just been much more limited because the RSVP thing has gotten really, is used regularly. Plus, everything is smaller because of COVID.
Sure.
Right. In your book too, you talk about it's when I'm reading it, I'm reading about how you have to rush to one place and rush to the other. Is it still like that? I know that certain situations come up, but can you talk a little bit about certain situations where you are just booking it on different forms of transportation?
Yeah. Well, I'd have to say the last time things have slowed down quite a bit again because of the access problem. But I would say for the last part of the Trump's time in office was crazy, because there was the impeachment going on. There was the State of the Union. I have a picture in my book of President Trump coming into the Capitol to give the State of the Union, to come into the House chambers. And the Supreme Court justices are there, and he's having to meet and say hi to Chief Justice Roberts, who is overseeing his impeachment, where they're giving the verdict the next day. So all that was like, ah, and then and we're sitting on steps, on concrete and metal steps up in the balconies at the State of the Union. So a couple of people are allowed on the floor, but only like 2 or 3 people that are photographers. So, I was very grateful to be let in at all for that particular one. And it was that whole period was so awful, as far as having to be in 2 places at one time, and then also having to run downtown to get special credentials and get verification of your shots and COVID tested before Biden's inauguration, and then the insurrection thrown in. That was a lot. But and that's one of the things that made me think.
I was hoping you could share a little bit more about the insurrection and what, number one, kind of that day was like for you, and how you ended up kind of in a dangerous area. And like, can you just talk about that day from your perspective?
Sure. I had wanted to go down for the counting of the votes, because we're normally not allowed into the Senate chamber at all, other than every 4 years for the certification of the votes. And I had never done that in my 30-year career. So I thought, why not now? So I requested that and was denied because of COVID restrictions, that very few people were allowed in there. And then I said, all right, well, I tried, and that's it. So I was not even thinking of going, because I saw President Trump so much. I was not going to that Stop the Steal rally necessarily. I had other things I was working on. And so I decided that I wasn't going. And then I heard on the radio and on TV, they're saying, whatever you do, don't go downtown today. It's going to be a potentially very dangerous situation. And people in my line of work, that's when you say, let's go.
Right.
So we jumped in the car and ran down there. And then I thought, okay, he's talking. So we're listening to his speech along the way, and thought, well, the people are going to be going towards the Capitol. So I'm going to position myself at the Capitol so that they're coming towards me instead of being, locked into the crowd. And so that's what I did. And then everybody as I talk about in that chapter in the book, everybody had their cell phone on speaker. Yeah.
Mhm.
And so you could hear President Trump's voice everywhere. And he was just down the street a short way. And so the people were okay. But as the crowd and Vice President Pence came in while we're waiting, and I'm doing crowd pictures, and there was all kinds of interesting get up that people were wearing, like dressed up like the Statue of Liberty and all kinds of things. So I was keeping myself busy there doing that, and then turned and saw the Proud Boys, and I knew they were the Proud Boys. I can't say how, because they didn't have like t-shirts on that said Proud Boys. They just had an aura about them where it was like they're in charge and get out of our way. And there was about 300 of them there that day. I saw maybe 100 of them were over on the side where I was, and one of them started yelling derogatory things to me. So I ended as being a member of the media. So I kept photographing, and they kept walking towards me. And then when they got maybe 20 yards away, because I'm backing up while I'm photographing, right? And then I saw a tree, and I thought, let me jump behind here, which I did. And then I put my credentials in my jacket for the rest of the time, because it was too dangerous to be a member of the media.
Wow.
And then there was, it was just surreal the way that when they got there, things changed so much from people all over the country that were there, and nobody was hostile or angry at all. And then as they came in, the entire mood changed, where it was just full of hate. And I can't even describe it. Just the whole, and then people that were coming in all of a sudden were having a lot of tactical gear and bulletproof vests and walkie-talkies and camo vests and a couple of gas masks, and everything was changing. And then there was this one older woman nearby where I was, and this one guy came, and he could have been one of the Proud Boys. I think he might have been. He came over and said to her, the fencing, because everybody was kept behind this riot fencing, and he said, you need to get out of the way, because my guys are going to be taking that fence down there, and things are going to get crazy here, and you're going to be trampled. So the older lady goes, uh-oh. So she got out of Dodge, and I was like, where are you coming through exactly? And he pointed over to was maybe 50 yards away, 25 yards away. And so I started heading over to that area. And sure enough, just like he said, within like 4 minutes, the police came running up and trying to do double reinforcements with each other. And then the fence came down, and she would have been trampled.
Wow.
So, and then by then things are really getting out of control. And everybody was chanting, stop the steal. And this is on the east side of the Capitol. The west side of the Capitol was way worse than where I was, but where I was significant. So as people were going up the stairs of the Capitol, somehow things had changed after the fencing came down. Things had kind of changed from a crowd to a mob. And as people were going up the stairs, the chanting changed from "Stop the Steal" to "Hang Mike Pence." And we knew that he was in the building. And around the corner on the west side of the Capitol was a gallows and a noose. And it just was totally out of control. And then, people got up to the top of the stairs, and first there was like victory kind of thing, and then they started smashing the windows out. So it was a absolutely surreal time. And after covering that, immediately following the impeachment and that wild State of the Union, then uh, and I also covered Biden's inauguration. All the other inaugurations, there had been tens of thousands, sometimes a million, like with President Obama, of people. When you look out at the Capitol as the sun is the dawn is breaking, and you look out, you see all these, all these people for as far as you can see. It's just wall to wall people. And with that, we looked out, and I was very grateful that I was included in getting credentials for that, because a lot of people did not. But I had a terrible position, but I was still on the grounds. So I looked out that morning, and there was no one there but 25,000 National Guard with high-powered rifles. And I saw, that's the end to my book, of this book. Not to say, I could do a couple more, but this book was, to me, and with my pinched nerve in my spine, that the cortisone shots wearing off, and I have like 30 pounds of camera equipment to be climbing over walls and getting up this big hill. I was a train wreck for 3 days after that, because they couldn't give another cortisone shot again, and I completely undid what they did. So thank God for physical therapy, and I was back to work again. But they said, don't even pick up a camera for a month. So I couldn't even work at all for 1 month afterwards. So
That this job is not for the faint of heart. I mean,
no.
after reading your book, I thought just even, you have to be mentally prepared and mentally just ready for this challenge to be a little aggressive and get your position and get the shot that you want, but also to deal with things like this, to deal
Mhm.
with, I mean, this sounds like it was a war zone. I mean, it appeared to be a war zone to
It was
people
a
like,
war zone. I tried to
yeah,
get
yeah.
over to the west side of the Capitol. I was making my way over that way, and there was so much tear gas that people were coming out of there. Unless you had a gas mask on, you just couldn't get over there by the time I was heading over there. So that's sadly, I hate to think that that should be part of my gear, is having a gas, just like a mask that you wear now for COVID, that you need to have a gas mask in your camera bag. I hope it doesn't come to that, but that's not how I normally travel.
Mhm.
Have you reached a point where you can kind of sense when something's about to happen, to like the new, like almost have a sixth sense, like the news people are saying, all right, something's about to happen. I better get ready with my gear and everything
Mhm.
else.
Yeah, yeah, I do. And that's one thing that I like to say to other photographers that are starting out, is trust your gut, and trust your instincts on things. Like, I was so caught up in the mob going up the stairs while I was photographing, and things were happening so quickly, that you were getting swallowed up. And then the next thing I knew, it was like being in a concert back in the day,
Mhm.
right? Where you're standing up, and all of a sudden you can't even hardly lift your arms up because there's people smashed in front of you and the side of you and behind you. It was the same kind of thing, where all I could get at one point was the head of the person in front of me, because I was so crushed in, and it was just wall to wall people. So I made my way out along the side of the crowd to work the peripheral side of it, so that I could still move freely and not be crushed, which was also, a plus.
If you had one or two pictures that you're maybe most proud of or think they're just some of your best work, what comes to mind?
Uh, I would have to say one of my favorites is the three presidents walking out of the Oval Office together of Clinton, Obama, and Bush, because, and that's back when I thought my book was going to be done. After Obama, I was like, well, how nice is this that all three presidents are right here together? And that really struck me about how they are so unique in being the leaders of the free world, and that they're in a special club there, that only each one of them knows what it's like to be in that office and under the intense scrutiny, and having to greet the family members at Dover Air Force Base of the I think it's Air Force Base, Dover base there, where they bring the dead soldiers in with the families and stuff. That's just gut wrenching kind of things. The Sandy Hook and having to deal with stuff like that, that nobody understands that, I think. And plus the whole bubble aspect of it, where there's nothing you can do that is not documented. So, and if God help you, if you go bike riding with your toe clips on and fall off your bike, then everybody says you're old and you're an idiot. And that's unfortunate because that happens to everybody.
Another thing, the title of your book, The Eyes That Speak, and the cover, and just looking at the different expressions. And one that really stood out to me that was in your book was after when Clinton is on stage with Hillary, and I can't remember if Chelsea's on Al Gore's behind him, and it looks as if Hillary's been crying. It looks as if Clinton has been crying. Um, can you talk a little bit, before we go, about just what you see in the eyes of different people that you photograph?
Yeah, well, that particular incident, that was during his when he got busted for the Monica Lewinsky incident, and that was in the Rose Garden, that picture that you're speaking of. And yeah, that was Hillary, Al Gore, and the president there. Uh, that was a very difficult situation to get into, because that was another time of having to be in three places at once, and that was in the film days, and I had to have my film processed and then run back, taking the train back from DC to Bethesda, which is about, I think, 7 or 8 stops, getting off of there, running to my lab, getting that done, sending them out in the old school days, the analog days, which took forever, unlike now where people are transmitting live while the president's talking. And so then I'm there working at my desk, and they go, oh, the president's going to respond at the White House now to the charges of being, the impeachment. And I was like, oh my God. So, went back down, and was running up the driveway, and was not able to get out into the Rose Garden where he was speaking. So a friend of mine, Scott Applewhite, another photographer, famous one from Associated Press, he had been out in there taking pictures, and he was bringing his film to a courier to take it to be processed, and was going back out, and I was the only one in the briefing room, and I was jumping up and down because they were like, and I asked the Secret Service agent, please let me just hang outside the door. He's like, no. I said, oh God, this is awful. So with Scotty there, Scotty goes to go back out talking to the same agent, and he goes, look, I'm with Associated Press, I just dropped my film, I got to get back out there. And the agent goes, all right. And I was almost one person with Scotty. I was smashed against his back as he went out, and he goes, well, you're gonna have your work cut out for you, because everybody's already in position. And I said, that's all right, I just need to get there, I'll work it out. And I just worked the outside of the crowd, which is the secret, my secret recipe to getting to, in big events like that where there's a big crowd, is going along the outside of the crowd and then working your way across. And then I ended up like 4 people back from the president for that picture. And yeah, that was so tough for her, as I say in the book, for Hillary, to have her personal life and her professional life collide right in front of the world. that had to be a real bad moment.
Well, we could tell so many stories, but your book shares a lot of them. And so we, suggest that you guys go check out Eyes That Speak, One Woman News Photographer's Journey with History Makers. Thank you so much, Christy, for being on the show today.
Thank you. It's available on Amazon or fine bookstores.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.